Chapter 10. Positive Action. It soon became apparent that the feeling of unrest was rife, not only among the rank and file of the people, but also among the government officials, the chief, and the intelligentsia. Their discontent, however, was not born of suffering, but of fear of what they might have to suffer if something was not done to check the surging nationalism, this sudden political awakening of the youth and the man in the street. The words positive action, which I had used at the June rally in Accra, spelt fear in the minds of my opponents as soon as it became generally known that I intended leading the party in a campaign of non-violent positive action. Rumors reached me that plans were being made to deport me from Accra. In fact, the local Gold Coast radio announced that I had already been banished from the capital. Shortly after this, I received a letter asking me to appear before the Gar State Council, the traditional local authority, in order to discuss the unfortunate lawless elements in the country and any possible solution. I went along with two of my supporters and was surprised to find that among those present were the ex-members of the working committee of the UGCC. The agenda that had been drawn up for the meeting was never referred to. All the speeches that were made were on one subject alone, and the whole idea of the meeting appeared to be to censure me for introducing the words positive action into the country and thereby threatening violence. What exactly do you mean by positive action? I was asked. I took the time and explained to them as fully as I could, but, as I might have expected, it did not satisfy certain of my long-standing political opponents who were present. The Gar Manche, the paramount chief who was presiding, then suggested that I should convene a meeting of my followers and explain to them, in the same terms that I had just used to the meeting, the meaning of positive action and report to the State Council when I had done so. I agreed to do this and immediately left. It seemed to me that this was a matter that should go down on record as a considered statement. I therefore took a pencil and paper and, a few hours later, completed a pamphlet entitled What I Mean by Positive Action. In it, I explained that because the term positive action had been erroneously interpreted and publicized as being a threat of violence, the imperialists and their agents were perturbed. I had been called before the Gar State Council where I had explained to those present the true meaning of the term. That meeting concluded with a recommendation that I should call a meeting of the people and make the same explanation. I denied that I was going to be deported and protested against a false report in the foreign press that the chiefs had demanded an undertaking from me to cause no trouble when the Kusi report was published. If I refused, the report had said, I would be deported to Nzima. I went on to discuss the aims of self-government and affirmed that the next step was a question of strategy. That although the British government and the British people, with their die-hard imperialists, acknowledged the legitimacy of our demand for self-government, it was only by our own exertions that we should succeed. I pointed out that there were two ways of achieving self-government, one by armed revolution and the other by constitutional and legitimate non-violent methods. As an example, I gave the repulsion by British armed might of two German attempts at invasion and the victory over British imperialism in India by moral pressure. We advocated the latter method. Freedom, however, had never been handed over to any colonial country on a silver platter. It had been won only after bitter and vigorous struggles. Because of the educational backwardness of the colonies, the majority of the people were illiterate, and there was only one thing they could understand: action. I described positive action as the adoption of all legitimate and constitutional means by which we could attack the forces of imperialism in the country. The weapons were legitimate: political agitation, newspaper and educational campaigns, and as a last resort, the constitutional application of strikes, boycotts, and non-cooperation based on the principle of absolute non-violence as used by Gandhi in India. It would appear, the pamphlet continued, that the government was not pleased with our warning, that they would have preferred us to spring a surprise on them. But we preferred justice and fair play and to act above board. We had nothing to hide, and the members of the CPP, as members of a democratic organization, had every right to be prepared for any eventuality. The final stage of positive action, I stated, would not be called into play until all other avenues for obtaining self-government had been closed. We would first study the Kusi report. If we found it favourable, all well and good. If not, we would put forward our own suggestions and proposals. If these were rejected, then we would invoke positive action on the lines already explained. We all wanted self-government, and we had a legitimate right to decide for ourselves the sort of government we desired. I urged the people to be calm and resolute until the publication of the report of the Kusi Committee. By 9 o'clock the following morning, after having worked all night with the copper printing machine at the office of the Evening News, I managed to print about 5,000 copies of this pamphlet. The same afternoon, I called a mass meeting at the arena and read my statement out to the crowds. I then reported to the Gar State Council that I had carried out their wishes. Immediately after this, I made a tour of the Western Province in order to explain to the people in the more inaccessible areas what positive action entailed and how it could be used to achieve our aim. The point I stressed everywhere, however, was that this measure would be used only when all else had failed. The report of the Kusi Committee had been published at the end of October 1949. It was thought to be quite unsatisfactory as a step towards constitutional freedom, and the general discontent was becoming so acute that I decided some action would have to be taken. On returning from my tour, therefore, I called together the Ghana People's Representative Assembly on the 20th of November. This mammoth gathering was the first of its kind and was attended by representatives from over 50 organizations. In fact, the only two organizations in the country that were not represented, apart from the statutory territorial councils which refused to honor my invitation, were the Executive Committee of the United Gold Coast Convention and the Aborigines Rights Protection Society. The latter society, although it was still in existence, had actually ceased to play any active part in the country's affairs. But it had been my original intention to invite them to convene this assembly. However, owing to a most insulting reception which the then president of that body gave to two of my envoys in Cape Coast, I was compelled to withdraw the invitation. My object in calling together this assembly was to coalesce a public opinion against the Kusi report and to urge the people into effective action. The Assembly resolved that the Kusi report and His Majesty's government statements thereto are unacceptable to the country as a whole, and declared that the people of the Gold Coast must be granted immediate self-government, that is, full dominion status within the Commonwealth of Nations based on the Statute of Westminster. They also drew up a memorandum outlining the structure of central and local government, which they desired to see incorporated in a new constitution. The chiefs at Dodowa, led by Sir Sibu Daku and Nana Ofori-Atta II, did not accept the views of the People's Representative Assembly. I would have been prepared to discuss the matter further in an endeavour to come to some kind of an agreement, but the speeches that were made by some members of the council, particularly by the president, Nana Ofori-Atta II, seemed to me to be so abusive and couched in such undignified language that I felt that any hope of a compromise was out of the question. I returned to Accra dismayed by the fruitlessness of the journey and the unpleasant attitude of the chiefs, but I continued to press the government to give consideration to the people's demand for the convening of a constituent assembly. I called a meeting of the Executive Committee of the Convention's People's Party, and acting on their authority, I informed the governor in a letter drafted on the 15th of December that if his administration continued to ignore the legitimate aspirations of the people as embodied in the amendments to the Kusi Committee's report by the People's Representative Assembly, then the CPP would embark upon a campaign of positive action based upon non-violence and non-cooperation, and that they would continue with this until such time as the British government gave consideration to the right of the people of Ghana to convene their own constituent assembly of elected representatives of the people, to consider the Kusi report and, if possible, to draw up a new constitution. In short, we were prepared for a showdown. The same day, I published on the front page of the Evening News a stirring article headed "The Era of Positive Action Draws Nigh." Later, before a large gathering at the arena, I warned the people to prepare for positive action. If nothing had been done by the British government concerning our request for a constituent assembly within 2 weeks from that date, I told the crowd that positive action would take place any time thereafter. I impressed upon them, however, that there should be no looting or burning of buildings, no rioting, damage or disturbance of any sort, that the success of our cause depended on the non-violent and peaceful character of our struggle. Accepting this challenge, the government took the offensive by instituting a series of prosecutions against the editors of the newspaper which I had founded and which were, quite naturally, supporting the agitation. Several of the editors were sent to gaol, and myself, I was soon brought into court to defend a case of contempt which had been filed against me as a result of an article which appeared in the Secondi Morning Telegraph. The courtroom on this occasion was so packed with people that hundreds who had been unable to squeeze themselves into the building were massed noisily outside. Because of their strenuous and uninterrupted demonstrations in support of me, it was difficult to hear what was going on in the court. In the end, I was faced with a fine of £300 or 4 months' imprisonment. Fortunately, the people of Accra and various party members rallied together and managed to get enough money to pay the fine, thereby enabling me to continue my agitation and the struggle against imperialism. Soon after this, I went on another tour of the country. While I was away, a dispute had arisen between the Meteorological Employees Union and the government. Negotiations between the two parties broke down, and the meteorological workers appealed to the TUC, who sympathized with them and indicated their readiness to support them. It was agreed that if the demands of the Meteorological Employees Union were not accepted, the TUC would declare a strike. The threat of a strike at this particular time increased the popularity of positive action. When I realized on my return that all chance of settling the dispute had broken down, I made an attempt to intervene to see if I could settle it, but this was not accepted by the government. By intervening, however, I succeeded in my intention, which was to postpone a strike at that particular time, as this might have endangered the success of positive action, if and when it came into operation. It appeared that while I had been away, the police had been searching for me to give me a letter from the Colonial Secretary, Mr. R. H. Salloway, an ex-Indian civil servant. The letter was eventually handed to me round about midnight on the day I returned to Accra. It contained an invitation to meet the Colonial Secretary in his office the following morning. I immediately called a meeting of the Executive Committee of the party and put the matter to them. It was unanimously agreed that I should go. The following morning I set out with 3 of my colleagues who waited for me while I had my talk with the Colonial Secretary. I went straight to the port and made my position quite clear. "It's all very well, Mr. Nkrumah," Mr. Salloway said, not unkindly, "but things are getting to a point when I've just got to find some way of bringing some kind of order into the country." "But order, as far as you government officials are concerned," I replied, "means suppressing the rank and file, having them where you want them, to be told what is best for them and what they have to do. The whole country is politically awakened, and it cannot be lulled to sleep again so easily. The people want their grievances addressed." "But don't you see that this positive action that you are planning will bring chaos and ultimate disorder into the country?" the Colonial Secretary waited for these words to sink in. "And I'm just afraid I must warn you that if anything disastrous happens as a result of this positive action, if anybody is killed or hurt, you will be held to be personally responsible. You must think seriously before you take this step. Now take India, for instance," he went on. Now, India was a very different matter. The Indian was used to suffering pains and deprivations, but the African has not that spirit of endurance. Mark my words, my good man. Within 3 days, the people here will let you down. They'll never stick it. Now, had this been India, I cut him short. I must make myself quite plain, Mr. Salloway, if I have failed to do so up to now. If the British government refuses to consider the resolution adopted by the Ghana People's Representative Assembly, then no alternative remains to me but to keep my word with the people and to declare positive action. All we are asking for is that the Constituent Assembly, which necessitates dividing the country into constituencies, calling a general election and letting the people decide for themselves whether they will adopt the Kusi report or not. He said he sympathized with me, but he gave me no assurance that anything would be done, that even an attempt would be made on the part of the government to consider my appeal. I bade him farewell and immediately called a meeting of the executive committee to report to them the result of the interview. They all backed me wholeheartedly. The next meeting that I had with Mr. Salloway was attended by 4 of us. I had picked my 3 companions from among those of the party whose views were less radical than most. We went over the same old ground and reached no agreement. The same day an announcement was made over the local radio that positive action had been abandoned. Obviously, the government officials, realizing the effect that the failure of my meeting with the colonial secretary might have, had hurriedly taken measures to keep law and order among the masses. I immediately convened a meeting at the arena and made it abundantly clear to the crowds who assembled there that positive action had certainly not been abandoned. Very much to the contrary. The following Saturday night, we had an all-night session of the executive committee at which it was decided to declare positive action on the following day, if no satisfactory reply had been received from the colonial secretary. A letter did come from Mr. Salloway. This said that the government was considering the whole matter that day and that, in view of this, positive action should be suspended. The whole morning went by and part of the afternoon. Our nerves were on edge and the atmosphere was extremely tense. The TUC had already decided to declare a strike which had been in action since midnight on the 6th of January, 2 days earlier. At 5 o'clock I decided I had waited long enough and called a meeting at the arena. There I declared to the people that apart from the hospital workers, those employed on the water conservancy and other public utilities, and the police, a general strike should begin from midnight. The response of the people was instantaneous. The political and social revolution of Ghana had started. Immediately after this, I rushed off to Cape Coast, Sekondi and Takwa, in the mining areas, and in each of these places I formally declared positive action. When I returned to Accra on the 10th of January, I discovered, to my annoyance, that the enthusiasm of the people in positive action was waning. Mr. Salloway's words hammered in my brain in mockery. Now had this been India? The reason for this dwindling of enthusiasm, however, was the fact that the colonial government were using the radio as a propaganda machine and announcing in each area that people should go back to work like their brothers in other areas. As the Cape Coast Daily Mail described it, to the detriment of its editor, it was a campaign of lies. When I saw that some of the stores in Accra had opened and that an attempt was being made to resume normal business, I knew that further agitation was necessary. Early in the morning of the 11th of January, therefore, I left the party headquarters where I had taken up residence and set out on foot, dressed in a Northern Territory smock to the office of the Evening News in order to launch a fresh campaign. I had barely gone 300 yards when I was joined by an excited crowd of supporters from all walks of life. As we proceeded, we were joined by more and more until by the time we reached the middle of Horse Road, in the vicinity of the Evening News office, the crowd was so thick that they seemed to be wedged in a solid block and all traffic was brought to a standstill. In order to disperse the crowd, I announced that they should all proceed to the arena, where I would meet them in a short while. In spite of this, hundreds were still tagging along with me, and the position became so desperate that I rushed for a taxi and went to the house of a friend of mine in Osu, a district of Accra. I remained there for about an hour to get my breath and to sort out my plans in peace and quietness. Then I went on to the arena where the whole of Accra appeared to be assembled. I spoke to them for about 2 hours. At the end of it, no government propaganda machine could have succeeded in pacifying or controlling them. Their blood was fired and they wanted justice. What is more, they would not stop until they had got justice. The tension was soon sensed throughout the whole town, and it was hardly surprising to any of us at 7 o'clock that that evening an emergency was declared for the whole country and a curfew imposed. Positive action had now begun in earnest. All the stores were closed, the trains stationary, all government services had closed down, and the workers were sitting at home. The whole economic life of the country was at a standstill. Public meetings were forbidden, and all party letters were opened and censored. The Evening News, the Cape Coast Daily Mail, and the Secondi Morning Telegraph fanned the flame by exhorting the workers to stand firm and to continue positive action. Then the office of the Evening News was raided and closed down by the police, and the newspaper was banned. The same was the fate of my other two newspapers. After this, arrests were beginning to take place, beginning with the party leaders in Kumasi and followed by those in Secondi. Each of my editors was in trouble. The editor of the Evening News was arrested on a sedition charge for publishing an article entitled Pull for the Shore. Then the editor of the Daily Mail was similarly charged for articles appearing in that paper entitled The Campaign of Lies and We Speak for Freedom. And the editor of the Morning Telegraph was gaoled for contempt of court. When positive action had almost reached its climax, an invitation arrived from the Joint Provincial Council of Chiefs, asking the leaders of the Convention People's Party, the ex-servicemen and the TUC to meet them at Dodowa in an endeavour to come to some understanding and to arrive at a peaceful settlement with the government. It transpired that the government and the Joint Provincial Council were attempting to suppress positive action by arresting the key supporters. Before the representatives of the TUC set out from Secondi, they received a message from their headquarters that they should not attend the meeting, and they accordingly stayed away. The ex-servicemen were arrested before they arrived at Dodowa, and so, when I and 3 of my companions succeeded in getting through unscathed, we discovered that we were the only invitees who were present. Once more, I put the case of the Ghana People's Representative Assembly before the Joint Provincial Council. We the people believe that our request for the election of a Constituent Assembly is reasonable and just. We will not accept half measures. The report of the Kusi Committee, a committee on which the rank and file of the people were not represented, is a matter that concerns us all. It is only right that we should have a chance of rejecting or accepting this report. If our request is not given consideration, then I have to tell you that the positive action will continue, because I've stood my ground. The speeches that followed were abusive in the extreme. It is obvious, declared Dankwa, that the law as far as Kwame Nkrumah is concerned must go according to him. Then he added, "It is my opinion that those who go against any constitutional authority must expect to pay for it with their neck." This wretched meeting was followed up by various attacks on me and on the Convention People's Party in the Gold Coast Bulletin, now renamed the Gold Coast Weekly Review, a government-sponsored publication. It was here that I said in a speech at the arena that if the chiefs would not cooperate with the people in their struggle for freedom, then a day would come when they will run away and leave their sandals behind them. Almost daily now, the police raided the party headquarters in an attempt to arrest as many of the leaders as they could round up. I just looked at them disinterestedly as they searched the place, for I knew, as well as they did, that I was safe for the time being. I was to be their final kill. First, I must see all my comrades safely behind bars before I suffered the same fate. Perhaps they felt that my nerves would break down and that I would run to the British authorities and on bended knees seek forgiveness for my wicked ways. My nerves were steadier than they had ever been, and I could hold out just as long as they. On the 17th of January, Kojo Botsio was arrested and detained at the police station where I managed to send food to him each day. As the general secretary of the party, his office was searched with tooth-comb thoroughness, and all party literature was confiscated. In the streets of Accra, Syrians, Lebanese, and British nationals were appointed as special constables and given truncheons to help them restore order. Some of these people took the law into their own hands and seemed to take pleasure in beating up anybody who happened to be walking anywhere near them. Accra became the scene of persecution. At this period, a number of people disappeared and were never accounted for, and certainly many people were injured. Things came to a head when an ex-serviceman's demonstration clashed with the police and resulted in the deaths of 2 African policemen. The government's the government's nets then tightened and the daily haul increased. On Friday the night of the 21st of January, they arrested most of my comrades. It was in fact only mere chance that I was not among them. Had I been arrested then, I am convinced, the tension being as it was, and intensified by the deaths of 2 policemen, I would probably have been torn to pieces in the excitement of what was then intended to be the final roundup. It so happened that I left the party headquarters that day at about 4 p.m. in order to visit a party member who had lived at Labadi. On arrival at his house, I found that he had gone out to his farm a few miles away, so I decided to wait his return. When he arrived, however, it was 6 o'clock, and as this was the hour of curfew, it was quite impossible for me to leave the house. My friend lent me a blanket and I slept on the floor. It was during that night that I had a most vivid dream. A big black umbrella seemed to be descending upon me like a huge tent until it completely smothered me for what seemed like 5 minutes, during which time I was fighting for my breath. Then it lifted and I woke up lying, staring as it seemed to disappear into the distance. According to the African, such a dream would be interpreted as a narrow escape from death or extreme danger. At 8 o'clock in the morning, I left the house and made my way to the party headquarters. As soon as I approached, I could see what had happened. The police had completely ransacked the place and were waiting patiently for my return. They had, I discovered later, even taken my personal servant, Nyamake, and some of his companions and brutally beaten them at the police station in the hope that they would break down and tell them where I was hiding. But the poor people had no idea at all where I was. As soon as one of the police officers caught sight of me, he hurried towards me, obviously expecting that I was going to make a dash for it. I was perfectly calm and continued to walk at the same pace and in the same direction. It seemed almost with apology that he took hold of my arm as he informed me that I was under arrest. "That's all right," I said, "but let me first go and get my things." I was then taken in a police wireless van, where I had heard on the radio that all was quiet. No trouble and all quiet at the scene of arrest, it coldly announced. Had they forgotten that Positive Action was a campaign of non-violence, I wondered? On arrival at the police station, I realized for the first time that I had become quite an object of curiosity. The crowd that had assembled there, both Africans and Europeans, were, I am sure, expecting to witness a most spectacular scene, the final arrest of this elusive revolutionary. It must have been something of a disappointment to them when a very ordinary-looking African walked quietly out of a police van and made his way without any fight or resistance toward the police station. It was a relief to be in the police station away from all those inquisitive eyes. I was searched and then taken before the police magistrate where the charges were read to me. I was then taken up to James Fort Prison where I was detained until my trial came up. Anticipating my ultimate arrest, I had made it clear to the people during my recent tours of the country that if at any time I should be arrested, it was important that they should keep calm and make no demonstration of any kind. Because of this, there was no commotion when I was taken into custody. The people, I thought, will support me to the end. I will not fail them, ever.